Hi there, this is Josh from Literary Gladiators, and today I'm here with a book review and discussion. The reason that I'm going to be splitting it into two parts is because I feel that the book that I'm going to be talking about deserves a review and recognition for people that have yet to read it, but I'm also going to be discussing particular details that may give more away to the piece at hand, and it would benefit for the person that has yet to read it to come back and watch the discussion part of the video after reading it so that there is more to engage in conversation about. The book that I'm talking about is Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna by Edith Sheffer. And this book has to do with Dr. Hans Asperger, who was an Austrian pediatric psychiatrist who lived from 1906 to 1980. He was active for most of his life, but his major rise took place during the Third Reich of the Second World War in Nazi-occupied Vienna, which Dr. Asperger was a crucial practicing physician at one of the clinics that examined children with mental disabilities. And in the Third Reich, those that had these disabilities did not fit into the requirements of what it meant to be a participating member of Nazi regime. So people with mental disabilities that did not fit in were sent to an institution known as Spiegelgrund and were euthanized, which that really puts Dr. Asperger's legacy into question because he was there for these events. He had the opportunity to leave, like many of other doctors and psychiatrists. One prime example is Sigmund Freud, who was Austrian, but he moved to the United Kingdom before the Second World War. And some of his colleagues moved. Leo Kanner, who was the founder of what we know today as autism, in its lower functioning impression. But Dr. Asperger benefited from the decrease of Jewish doctors. Many of his mentors were practicing members and architects of the way that these practices took place. But as for Dr. Asperger himself, we get into the big question is whether or not he was a crucial factor in the extermination of mentally disabled subjects. Probably the most accurate description comes in the introduction of the piece. Sheffer expands on it throughout the text, but she says that Asperger was neither a zealous supporter nor an opponent of the regime. He was an exemplar of this drift into complicity, part of the muddled majority of the populace who alternately conformed, concurred, feared, normalized, minimized, repressed, and reconciled themselves to Nazi rule. So in essence, Dr. Asperger was not an Oskar Schindler or an Irina Sendler, but he was more so a compliant, he was a compliant citizen, despite the fact that he did do his best to find redeemable qualities in some of his patients and see if he could fit them into Nazi society. But those that he found as not being redeemable were signed over to Spiegelgrund. But I gave this book 5 stars out of 5 because I felt that this is the early bird that caught the worm on this subject. It was very accessible. It had a great deal of information that you would need to know about this lens of the Holocaust. And I feel that it really did its best to concentrate on its thesis, where the subject of the book is the children that were sent to Asperger's clinic and his relation with them, but at the same time, the greater picture of the practices and what happened to these children. I really think that this is an important book that people should be reading. It just came out this year. I barely get books in hardcover, but this caught my attention right away at Barnes & Noble, and I had to pick it up and read it. This is the review section. It's very challenging to incorporate elements of discussion. So if you want to stick around or you've read the book, I encourage you to continue to watch this video. If you would rather read the book first, I would encourage you to come back after finish reading this book. But for those of you that want to read the book first, thank you for tuning in and keep reading. But being an Aspergian that was diagnosed in the 2nd grade, I think that it's really important to know about the founder and what his contributions were to the condition that bears his name. As I mentioned before, Dr. Asperger was in no way a hero the way that Oskar Schindler or Irina Sedler were. But it would also be very unfair and harsh to say that he was the nucleus of the extermination of mentally disabled youth in Nazi Vienna. He was a compliant member, and there is evidence that he signed papers that sent these patients to Spiegelgrund, where they would be institutionalized and, in particular cases, euthanized. But he was not, he was not a full-fledged Nazi the way that Dr. Mengele or subjects of that nature were. Dr. Asperger actually never joined the Nazi Party. He did join organizations that supported the Nazi cause, and he did associate himself with people that made excruciating decisions that resulted in the deaths of mentally disabled youth. But his legacy is far more complex, given the situation at hand but also the fact that in this day and age, mental disabilities, especially those that were lower functioning, whether it be Down syndrome, schizophrenia, what we see today as lower functioning autism, they would put them into institutions, and these institutions were not very pleasant places. And parents would also send them to these institutions. And this didn't just happen in Nazi-occupied areas, but this happened in America. It happened in Britain. Happened in plenty of other countries as well. It's only been in recent years, I would say beginning in the 60s, where they started to develop a sense of understanding, treatment, special education, to which there was a sense of acceptance for these people. But with Nazism, though, that was the incredible extreme where they would euthanize subjects that they did not find fit for their society. The only difference was if you were not Jewish, you could be Germanized, per se, as per the introduction. But Dr. Asperger took that into account, and he would meet with particular subjects that he found to be redeemable. He was a bit more biased in the way that he favored male patients as opposed to female patients, because he felt that male patients could develop a better fit for society in particular areas that would benefit the Nazi cause. It says in here, the particular areas that he was looking at, as per page 178, were mathematicians, technologists, industrial chemists, and high-ranking civil servants. It also makes mention to the fact that he had a fascination with those that were able to look at art in a particular lens, in a unique and different lens, whether it be the Rembrandt paintings or the Romanesque paintings. He didn't feel that what he calls calendar information or being able to memorize random facts such as tram routes were going to be useful, but he did feel that if he could mold them into productive citizens, that he would be able to release them. And he was able to help mentally disabled children adapt to society in that matter, but there were plenty of others that he also had to sign away. With females, he felt that their issues could also be attributed to their menstruation cycles, and there was this brutal incident where he was meeting with a female patient, and he forcefully punched her in the stomach, which was a very cringe-worthy moment. And the things that happened in Spiegelgrund were just immoral and atrocious. The way that they treated them, the way that they fed them, the way that they punished them, the way that they made them turn on one another. It was just heinous that this happened. Ultimately, Dr. Asperger said that he Dr. Asperger, his position started relatively clinical and a bit more accepting of the patients at hand, but as things grew deeper for the Third Reich, he began to feel a bit more reflective of their cause. Once Nazism was obliterated following the Second World War, he took a position that said that he was completely against what they were doing, and that he was a hero that saved plenty of children, plenty of mentally disabled children, but some of the things he said were a bit of an exaggeration. I wouldn't deem him to be I would deem Dr. Asperger to be nothing more than a conforming pediatric psychiatrist of his era, which I think you have to take into account. If it's very hard to say that you yourself, if you were in a situation where people were being exterminated and you were putting yourself and possibly even your family in jeopardy to help them, I think it's very easy to say that you would do the right thing and save these people. I think that there are plenty of us that would do that. But Dr. Asperger was not one of those people. And it's quite eerie that the autistic spectrum was reflective of what was deemed acceptable to the Nazi cause, and what would determine whether or not somebody would be able to live or die. And ultimately, the fact that the spectrum between the high-functioning end that bears Asperger's name to the more lower-functioning end that was examined by Dr. Leo Kanner, they just created a complete... they just measure it based off of a spectrum, along with PDD. But Lorna Wing ultimately regretted engaging in this labeling, because these labels began to be blown out of proportion and create a sense of crucial judgment on other people. And this judgment only adds a greater burden to their ability to function in society. And that is the underlying message that Sheffer leaves us with. Sheffer was inspired by her own son and how he was diagnosed with autism at 17 months old. And in the... usually I skip over the acknowledgments in a book, but in this book, this is something you have to check it out, because her son Eric leaves us with the idea of the great impact that labeling could have on people, and it really leaves a very strong message. And I think that this book gave me a greater understanding of Asperger syndrome and the legacy of Dr. Asperger himself. I cannot say that I hate Dr. Asperger for the choices that he made. I don't see him as being a hero, and I think that after reading this, my impression of him is of greater disappointment. But it would be very hard to blacklist him as being a because it's very hard to blacklist him as being a Nazi sympathizer, because he was a conformist, and that's probably the best way you can describe him. He was compliant to what he needed to do, and he went with the flow of things. I don't admire conformists, but I think that I think that many of us in some way or another are a bit more conformatory. We're more bystanders than we are upstanders. And perhaps after reading this, myself and anybody else that reads this piece can take action to, even if it's just developing a greater sense of empathy for other people and thinking before we judge, will help us go in a much more positive direction. And I think that books like Asperger's Children develop this sense of enlightenment and serve as a bit of a wake-up call for people like ourselves. I'm pretty sure I would highly suggest that you check out this book, because it will give you a greater sense of understanding about mental conditions and neurodiversity in the Nazi era, and how it ultimately shaped the way we see mental conditions even today, because there are so many other countries that judge disability, whether it be physical disability or mental disability, in this way. It's definitely not, there is definitely no, in most cases there's no euthanasia or termination for being physically or mentally disabled, especially in today's age. But this still serves as a cautionary moment in history. Thank you for tuning into this video, and for now, keep reading.